Great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Graham Ward. Graham Ward is the Regius Professor of Divinity here in Oxford, and he's also chair of the Faculty of Theology and Religion. He, in his long career, has covered many areas of interest, engaging in postmodern culture, but also with issues relating to science and religion. A recent book, which I greatly enjoyed, is called Unbelievable, but Graham promises us that one is on its way with the title Unimaginable. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Graham. And as you can see from the title that's now displayed on the screen, we have what potentially is a really interesting topic. And I can assure you we're going to hear from a really interesting speaker. Graham, you're most welcome.
I think I've got to give my thanks to the techno crew who put some of this together. And we're just going to hope it all works perfectly fine. So let me give you an overview of actually what I want to present. First, I want to relate transhumanism to co-evolution, the feedback ecologies of the biological and the cultural. And of course, to those of you here, that isn't new. It's the basis of Philip Hefner's work, among others. Though a commitment to an open and continuous creation raises the question of the uniqueness of what is human and the uniqueness that is itself in a state of transition. And of course, that isn't new either. It's the basis of Wenzel von Heystein's work, again, among others. Furthermore, both of these scholars relate their investigations to theology, even biblical theology, though not with respect to the biblical exegesis on creation and Christology that I'm going to be sketching this morning. And I can only sketch. A much more detailed exegesis will be part of a book that I'm trying to finish on ethical life too. Third, and this is where I do depart from the approaches of both Hefner and von Heystein, I want to relate a theological, anthropological, and biological account of transhumanism to the role of the imagination. The imagination is not necessarily just a human factor, or even a hominid factor. More about hominids later. Sleep scientists view dreaming as the imagination in default mode. And if this is right, and we have evidence that other animals dream, like cats and dogs, then imagination has co-evolved as part of a survival strategy and a teleonomy that is biocultural. As a greatly advanced symbolic species, see the work of Terence Deakin, then the human imagination is more expressive and creatively diverse than that of any other species. So, my question today, and a fundamental question, concerns precisely what is the role the imagination plays in transhumanism. What is it doing? And what does its doing signify? This, it seems to me, leads to several subset questions. What is the human imagination doing when it invents other forms of intelligent life? And why is it doing this? AI vampires are one instance of such invention. As far as I know, they have not been imagined before, and that they are therefore my invention. Secondly, how does human creativity, so profoundly associated with the imagination, relate to the co-evolving creativity that informs what we are and what we do? Both the vampire and the AI agent are transgressive creatures that blur the boundaries between the animal and the human with the vampire, and the artificial and the natural with the AI agent. And that leads to 3. How does this co-evolving creativity, in which human inventiveness plays such an important part, relate to a theologically informed understanding of creation that takes account of the economy of salvation? Again, I can only sketch proposals for an answer in this paper. And they are proposals. I'm not being dogmatic here. I'm just outlining how one Christian theologian makes sense of these questions in terms of soul formation, or how we become what we are in Christ. Now let's start biblically. According to chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, on the 6th day when humans were created, God created the animals, living creatures of every kind. There were creeping things and cattle, and they were explicitly created according to their kind. Then we were created, human beings. And we may have been created to have dominion over everything else, whatever dominion might mean, but we have no kind. No kind is mentioned in the Hebrew. In Hebrew, we are just hachadam, from the ground. So what we are, we who were created, according to what kind? Because we haven't got a kind. Now let's relate that biblical observation to both archeology and anthropology. I've often been struck by the earliest depictions of the human form in cave paintings and sculptures, in small freestanding statues that date to around 40,000 years ago. Whether we're talking about the figurines from Swabian forests or the bas relief sculptures in caves in southern France, what is interesting is that none of them have faces. There's a famous statue that was displayed in London recently in the Ice Age art exhibition of a human form that is possibly Neanderthal, and it has the head of a lion. There's a so-called sorcerer painted on a cave wall in Chauvet, but it has the head of a bird. There's a carving in a deep rock shelter deep in the Dordogne, this one, named Venus with the horn. But she has no face, and no attempt has been made at creating a face. Now, in the stunning cave art that has survived, animals do have faces, expressive faces. There's aggressive rhinos in Chauvet. There's bison in death throes in Niel. There's grazing reindeer in Font-le-Gum. Sly, sleepy horses at Cosquer. Elsewhere there are lions, cave bears, owls, and occasionally even a fish. In part, we can identify their species, even their gender, by these faces. But few depictions of a human being have a face that is recognizable as such. Where humans are depicted, they are stick-like, walking winter trees with bare, black limbs, or bulbous feminine forms with pendulous breasts and wide thighs. When the earliest of our kind stared on a sunlit day or a moonlight night into the stillness of a lake or pond, what they saw in their reflection was not an eye. They did not experience themselves as I. The carved and painted faces of the animals stare back at them and ask the one who paints or carves, "What are you?" We are this, but what are you? As King Lear came to understand when gazing upon poor Tom, human beings are fundamentally unaccommodated. We have no kind that is distinct from the other animals. So we have to grope towards what being a human creature means, recognizing constantly the fragility of being that creature and its place in the subtle ecology of relations that compose God's creation. So we're not simply the super dry kitted, John Lewis shoppers, Sainsbury-fed creatures we represent ourselves to be. Augustine once observed, we are a question unto ourselves. We're balanced on the edge of mysteries that are both internal and external, mysteries that transcend any final grasping. We're something other than what we make out. So we're not in possession of ourselves, however self-conscious and reflective we have become. Biblically put, we don't own ourselves. Psalm 100. Know that the Lord is God. It is he that has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Our self-understanding, then, is limited and prey to all sorts of illusions and projections, all sorts of fears and fantasies. Neuroscience informs us that at best, consciousness is less than 10% of what is most well lit within us. There are deeper, darker aspects to our being as to what we are. And that both fascinates and frightens us. The monster in the mirror of our fears is the figure of human desire written backwards, erased, as Harry Potter discovers when he views himself in the magic mirror. The silvered tane at the back of the mirror presents another kind of being normal. It's one that's difficult to face and to identify with. Furthermore, creation is an ongoing project. It's complete in the eternal mind of God as its creator. It is perfect. It is very good from the divine perspective. But subject to time, to chances and changes of the circumstantial, it continually evolves and adapts. The webs of environmental relations enfold us. They change us, we change them. The environment is not a house we live in, so much as a force field of dominions and powers in which we are actively situated. Theologically, this then raises the question of providence, where beginning reaches towards the eschatological perfection of its end. And salvation runs through its numerous dispensations of grace, grace that cannot be extracted from the material and cultural. The natural, then, is always incomplete for us, and we are incomplete within it. 6 million years ago, our species separated from the lineage of apes, and 2.2 million years ago, the homo races began. Probably plural, probably in Africa first, probably in the Americas last. We walked into our futures, whatever they might be, colonizing as we walked, evolving into other forms of Homo, erectus, Augustus, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthalis, more recently, Naledi, until Homo sapiens sapiens emerged. And at one time, several Homo species coexisted. So sapiens to date have won out on adapting to the new conditions, the new technologies, the new rewiring of the brain. But why should we be the last of the homo species? What is this genealogy and the evolutionary biology that underpins it? What it reveals is that what is homo is never quite homo enough. It was and is and will be in transit. We are then indeterminate creatures, open and even vulnerable to change, and also pioneers of that change ourselves in the ongoing complex causations of co-evolution. From the moment we came down from the trees and started to explore the world on 2 feet, we embarked then upon a transhumanism, an adaptation to environments that we change and that change us. Change that will only close when the homogeneous dies out or Christ comes. Now, let's relate these biblical, archeological and anthropological observations to Christian theology by examining how this transhumanism relates to Christ. For Christ, as the incarnation and revelation of God, came not just as a man, male genitalia and Adam's apple. He came as a homo sapiens sapiens. God reveals God's self in and to one species within the genus of Homo. In the Chalcedon formula on the hypostatic union, he is a creature of 2 natures, which in Greek is duophusein. But in Greek, phusis is more accurately translated all that is, not nature. For there is no distinction in the Greek language between the natural and the supernatural or anything else. So this is a creature of 2 realities, a creature of paradox who is both the perfection of the divine and the perfection of what is human. Furthermore, though human in all respects, he is human without sin. And so, since we know of no humanity that is without sin, both what is being human as what is nature lies with, both what is being human and what is nature are both lying within inverted commas. In the face of Christ, we glimpse what we may be, but we have to question all that we view ourselves currently to be. That this means that what we are has to be revealed to us through a journey of faith whereby we come to know even as we are known, as St. Paul put it. If we understand our souls as our life as it is hidden with Christ in God, then the journey of faith is a search for our soul, a soul that is formed in its Christ-likeness. We have to become what we are as images of God in Christ. But as the Desert Fathers recognized, in that search and upon that journey, we have to encounter the monstrous beneath the well-lit surfaces of our consciousness. The monstrous announces itself as distinct from us. It shows itself as alien to our kind. That's where we get the word from, the Latin monstere, to show, to demonstrate. The monster is unheimlich, uncanny. in the Scottish idiom that I'm very fond of, you don't ken what it is. It is both fearful and fascinating to us. The imagination conceives the monstrous, or the monstrous emerges in the imagination as an index of our deepest pathologies. Soul searching and soul formation will always have to come to terms with the monstrous, because it contradicts the image of ourselves that we create as distinct from the image of ourselves created in and through Christ. In engaging with the monstrous, humanity then is always transcending itself towards a perfection it cannot grasp. We can only imagine what our souls might be as we're caught up in the interchange of our fantasized, we might even say sinful, condition, and what Christ presents to us as fully human. The life of faith is a life in which the soul is formed, a soul in search of itself. In the book of Revelation, this is pictured as a name that will be given to all who overcome the judgment of the world on a white stone, a new name known only to him who receives it. Revelation 2:17. As we are, human persons then are like metaphors in search of their literal meaning, their meaning in Christ. So now, let's hook up these theological and anthropological observations more specifically with the specific inventions of the human imagination, vampires and agents with artificial intelligence. Of course, as inventions, there is a distinction. Vampires do not exist, and there's a great deal of money, science, and technology attempting to bring AI agents not just as robot forms, but as Nick Bostrom calls superintelligences. There's a lot of money, science, and technology going into making them exist. But we're dealing here with the imagination, and that's going to be important because the imagination conceives as both these entities, and at the level of the imagination, there's no difference between the factual and the fiction. The distinction only comes to play when we begin rationalizing about the products of the imagination. Despite the fame of the text in English, Carl Jung did not write a book entitled Modern Man in Search of a Soul. This was a collection of essays written by Jung that introduced his work to an English-speaking readership. Nevertheless, Jung is highly appreciative of the relationship between soul-making and psychology, and he will often move freely between the German psyche and the German Seele. If his work seems old-fashioned, then it needs to be revisited, because prior to the discoveries of paleoanthropology, body memory and epigenetics, Jung was already showing how the soul, or psyche, inherits dispositions and memories that are transgenerational and go back to the most primordial experiences. Being human is an open, ongoing, semantic and psychic project, and consciousness only has access to a small portion of what any subject belonging to larger communities both receives and responds to. We are part of complex ecologies in and through which we construct the stories about ourselves that may be, and frequently are, imaginative justifications for the kinds of persons we want to be. Jung called this ongoing process of meaning-making individuation. Sure, he believes in a hardcore self that psychotherapy can restore when it allows consciousness to be balanced against unconsciousness. And this hardcore self constitutes what he understands by soul. The soul is not a preformed spiritual kernel of what is you, that you heard behind admonitions like be yourself, be true to yourself. No, the soul is an emergent form and an unfinished project in personhood. But the soul isn't some enlightenment tabula rasa either. It comes laden with traces of its evolutionary past, memories locked into the unconscious, dispositions written into the body. The soul has analogues with the soft and malleable sense of the self argued for by any number of contemporary sciences, from the neuroscience of Antonio Damasio to the social science of Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and Bruno Latour. It's material and constructed, but it also open to pasts that it's never actually lived, and forces transcending it, invisible forces that bear upon the material, transcendent only insofar as they are not available for ego control, but not in and of themselves immaterial. Jung's work is an attempt to put us in touch with and accommodate the archaic monsters that lurk within our species, the monsters that haunt our dreams and imaginations, whether in literature or film, the monsters we necessarily have to face in the formation of the soul. Just before the outbreak of the First World War, in which Jung, then almost 40, served as a doctor, those monsters in himself surfaced dramatically. On the edge of what he feared was either schizophrenia or psychosis, he began hearing voices, experiencing hallucinations, having visions, and engaging his nightmares. Forensically, he submitted himself to analysis, committing observations, reflections, and even illustrations to what has become known as his Red Book. Permission for its publication was only given in 2008, 47 years after Jung's death. It contains a bizarre bestiary that enabled Jung to develop his theory of psychological archetypes, lodged deep in the unconscious, emerging from aeons of evolved experience out of which the human appears. One of these monsters is the blood-sucking ghost, and it becomes for Jung an icon of our search for the soul. Not as if the soul might or might not exist. For Jung, it existed, but its nature is again the subject of a continual search and a continual making. The vampire is the soul's endarkened shadow, and one of the monstrous forces, Jung's words, that envelops human beings. In an essay from 1931 entitled Seelenprobleme, die Gegenwart, the problem of the soul today, or the present soul problem, translated very unhelpfully as the spiritual problem of modern man, the blood-sucking ghost is a figure this is Jung's words, whose emptiness is taken for the unenviable loneliness of the modern person. A figure of the rootless, wandering creature who feeds on modern superficialities while not really being modern at all because he is unable to live in the present. Unlike any number of metaphorical employments of the vampire, particularly in the 19th century, the vampire is a figure for consumerist, capitalist greed and decadence. Jung's vampire is bloodless in his bloodlust. He cannot give because he has nothing to give. He can only take, and even then it can do nothing with what it takes, because it cannot convert it into what it most wants, that is, to live. He is instead a man without history, from whom past and future holds no meaning. He is one of the living dead, a figure of our destitution, the disappointment of our hopes and expectations for the future. He's a solitary, and when he stands before a mirror, he has no reflection, because he refuses to reflect upon that which repels him, wishing only to feed on his own self-illusions. Jung was a great admirer of the cinema, and no doubt behind his allusion to the blood-sucking ghost lies the vampire Count Orloff in the famous film made in 1922 by the German expressionist Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, Nosferatu. Murnau's monster speaks of the end of the Prussian aristocracy. The film was shot using Teutonic locations in a Germany fast changing in the wake of war and then the Weimar era. He feeds on souls, particularly of the bourgeois class, greedy, property-owning capitalists, but he has no soul himself. That's the point. He's a living corpse associated explicitly with the Black Death. He's a very far cry from the Louis de Pontelac and Rice's vampire in Interview with a Vampire, a celebrity figure played by Tom Cruise in the film alongside Brad Pitt. A far cry also from the sad romantic figure of Edward Cullen, Stephenie Meyer's vampire in the Twilight series. Both these vampires are eternally youthful, forlorn in the depths of their regret. Lonely men prey to their melancholy plight, longing for human companionship and the normal family life. Make no mistake, there's evil, voracious vampires in both those films, but there's also a kind of voyeurism that gazes upon the normal and mundane and nostalgically wishes to recapture their experience of it. They share a kinship, which I'll go on to say more about, a kinship with androids like Data in the Star Trek film First Contact, who, as the Borg Queen informs him, is in chaos because he desires to be human. As I said, I'll return to that later. Pitched as alienated outsiders or another bloodline, many contemporary vampires are far from being repulsive and monstrous. These figures fascinate and attract. They have soul and they have values. They search for love and to be loved. For this, they believe, will redeem them from their social curse. They are not Jung's dark carrion shadows haunting the unconscious. They are not decrepit and predatory parasites. Maya's vampires are able to take up professional jobs like doctors. They go to school. They live through the daylight hours. They don't return to sepulchral cellars and climb into coffins filled with ancient earth. They are images of gym-toned beauty. As products of the contemporary imagination, they are, I would argue, on the way to morphing into the next generation, a non-robotic, biologically synthetic generation of artificial intelligence. They embody transhuman perfections, more angelic than demonic. Human beings like Bella in the Twilight series want to become one of them. Welcome to the world of the techno-gothic. Vampires and vampire slayers with the savvy techno skills of super beings in Underworld and the Blade trilogy. Vampires that take on a futuristic gloss. This morphing of the vampire into synthetic hybrids of superior intelligence and enhanced physical powers is captured well in the final scene of the first Twilight film, Breaking Dawn, from 2008. Here, Bella, the sultry and existentially alienated adolescent teenager, chosen then as the bride of Edward Cullen, undergoes what is almost an operation to become a vampire and join the family. But it's that closing shot. She faces the camera eye that's peering above her, then zooming in so only her eyes, closed at first, are viewed, and then dramatically she opens her eyes, having entered into her new vampire existence, those two eyes staring at us like the eyes of a tigress. Now, why do I find this interesting? It was done in 2008. In 2009, James Cameron took that very final scene and used it in his film Avatar, where the soul or animating force of a crippled paraplegic, Jake Sully, migrates from his dead body and enlivens the synthetic body of an avatar. But that move from Bella to Avatar, the same cinematographic shot being actually used in both of them, it's a perfect segue for AI vampires. But before I go into AI vampires, I want to go into the mathematical mind of Mick Bostrom and his work on superintelligence. Because to read this book, where academic research and mathematical modelling blends with sci-fi, is to observe the workings of the scientific human imagination and its figurative projections of what is feared and fascinating about AI, what is attractive and desirable. Now, Bostrom, as many of you will probably know, is the director of the Future of Humanity Institute here at Oxford. AI, as he conceives it, is seeding. It's the crossover point in which it becomes superior to human intelligence, and the kinetics of intelligence explosion, these are all his phrases, shares the same duplex affective structure of all that we have seen associated with the monstrous. Fearful yet fascinating, alienating yet seductive. What is frightening, what is inspirational. In Bostrom's account of a super intelligent, wise singleton, again his coinage, we have a synthetic vampire that sucks all cosmic matter, energy, and life, organic and inorganic, into sustaining its maximal and ever ferocious efficiency. But what I want to point to is three aspects of Bostrom's study that I think are significant for my argument. First, There's nothing new here, imaginatively. Scientifically, of course, there's much that is new. But when it comes to transcribing a scientific investigation and advancement, his representations of superintelligence have analogues that go right back to angelologies and demonologies of ancient and medieval religions. We are treating then both the human capacity to imagine and the way that imagination has to fall back upon a repertoire of figures already conjured in past long gone, a repertoire which, as Jung showed, lived on in the psyche and emerges with our dreaming. Vampires are among those representational repertoire. Secondly, Bostrom conceives superintelligence according to 6 characteristics of a superpower. These are intelligence amplification, the capacity to operate strategically, prioritizing and calculating optimal achievements, the ability to manipulate social relations, a faculty for hacking into other systems and exploiting the knowledge gained, an aptitude for redesigning and modeling advanced technologies, where technologies are as much biological and chemical as mechanical, and skilled in facilitating economic advancement. To these, Bostrom doesn't add, but he uses the category speed. They can move very, very quickly. Now, every one of those characteristics in that figure can be found in the contemporary vampire and enable them to be, in Bostrom's own words, an extremely powerful agent. The difference at this point in the contemporary imagination is only a matter of where you were created. In the French trenches of the First World War for Edward Cullen, or an engineering laboratory in MIT. And of course, what you are made of, the organic matter that has biologically evolved, or the synthetic matter spun from molecular nanotechnologies. But in the co-evolutionary model of the world, can there be distinctions between the natural and the synthetic? And in the quantum model of the fabric of the cosmos, can life in what Bostrom calls an algorithmic economy, in an algorithmic soup, differ at all from life at the subatomic level, in the prebiotic conditions that produce replicating cells from fatty acids, liposome reactions, and protein change? Now, I'm not trying to pretend to be the scientist here. All this for me is book learning. But I think the questions, nevertheless, are valid. What makes the replicants of Blade Runner and the android hosts of Westworld so interesting from a cultural studies and therefore from a religious point of view is their embodiment. And because of that embodiment, their affective response to the world. And religion will often figure in their representations, as I'll show. At this point, I want to offer a critical interjection on Bostrom's imaginings, for they are projections of his and other AI specialists' imagining of figures that will be. All 6 of his characterizations are or issue from cognitive powers. This is what he writes. A superintelligence's power resides in the brain, not in the hands. Now, this is a very dualistic and Cartesian worldview that is both countered and corrected by products of the broader cultural sciences. The synthetic humanoids of Avatar, Westworld, and Blade Runner are very much embodied like the vampires. They utilize maximally physical power. They are not super brains in vats trying to find ways to escape their immobility. They are agents in every sense, moral agents insofar as their action has ethical consequences. Ethical consequences is central to the plots of both the films and the TV series. So, I find brain and mind are too interchangeable and undefined in Bostrom's book. Thirdly, in having independent agency, AI superintelligences edge in Bostrom's work towards having souls. Bostrom doesn't go into this, but in his conclusion to a chapter that then leads on to his discussion of superintelligent will, he says, is it possible to say anything about what a superintelligence with a decisive strategic advantage would want? Whence does this wanting arrive? Because surely what Bostrom is imagining here is an inner motivation, his word, that supersedes the algorithms of its early goal-setting programming. Any question about willing and motivation in a self-correcting, self-enhancing, auto-learning AI system is to move from the purely cognitive into the hinterlands of the affective, that which moves us, motivation, to act, that which is self-determining, that which has a self that can be determined. Does Bostrom then fall into an anthropomorphism he himself warns us time and time against? Is the anthropomorphism inevitable? Because figurations of artificial intelligence are human projections in a continuation of an age-old search for the soul, a search that representations of the monstrous have always been implicated in. Questions of desire and motivation have been at the forefront of theological and philosophical discussions about soul formation since Aristotle and Augustine. And questions concerning soul formation have always been implicated in religious worldviews. Let me approach, finally, all these questions by looking at a recent film that won an Academy Award for its creative computer-generating camera work, Blade Runner 2049. The plot of the film issues from a miracle. That's the word used in the film. A child born from a human being and a replicant. The Blade Runner, K, played by Ryan Gosling, stands before the desk of his boss, Lieutenant Joshi, in the Los Angeles Police Department, and he informs her about his discovery of the child's existence. She orders him to kill it, and then she tells him about the high wall. A high wall separating human beings from replicants who are slaves, and this wall must be maintained or chaos will ensue. Bostrom calls this chaos existential catastrophe because it puts into question the nature of human nature and its supremacy. K registers a resistance that the boss picks up. After all, he's retired any number of replicants before. Joshi challenges him to vocalize a resistance to a murder he is unable to explain, but which seems to trigger in him a new level of awareness. To be born is to have a soul, I guess. He's never killed someone with a soul before, someone who was born. The soul, of course, philosophically, is the life force animating the body, and replicants only have biologically manufactured bodies. There's no explicit theology or religion as such in the world of Blade Runner 2049, just as there's no nature and all the trees are dead. But religious themes run through the plot like the quicksilver down the veins of a replicant. Two are prominent in the scene I've just shown: the miraculous birth and the soul. And both are related to types of birth, of a woman and more obliquely of the possibility of the soul in life after death. Love, a superior and named replicant in the film, is called the best angel of all. Blade Runner 2049, like its predecessor Blade Runner, offers an inquiry into what it is that makes human beings a distinctive species. We're back then with that grand hominid and homo question that I opened with. What am I? A question that is fundamental to all the religions as the question about the nature and the character of the divine. It suggests the possibility that homos have a characteristic disposition to inquire into what makes them tick and why, and the word soul is significant here. It returns us to contemporary questions in philosophy, neuro and cognitive science about the nature of mind and whence it emerges and how. Bostrom, as I said, seems to conflate mind with brain and still works with an outdated analogue between the brain and the computer. For some reason, in Blade Runner 2049, soul was a more appropriate to the scriptwriters than mind or consciousness because of its depth of mythic resonance. Soul bestows a certain sacred dignity upon those who are born to it, rather like being made in the image and likeness of God. At one point in the plot, Kay even believes he might be the child, the miraculous child, and therefore have a soul. But then he discovers he's not the soul. Nevertheless, the film makes quite clear that he does have a soul, for he is able to empathize and creatively imagine, despite the fact that all his memories are manufactured implants. He develops emotional intelligence. He may be a human creation, but that creation still retains the very human created trait of searching for something he isn't yet, but knows he might be. At the end of the film, he sacrificed himself to bring together the father and the child, now grown into the young woman, and he dies from his martyred wounds in peace. I'm going to end here, very inconclusively, I'm aware, because it's just about as far as I've got. And the aim of what I'm doing this morning was not to answer the questions I posed, but to begin to open new and imaginative lines of inquiry. Fundamentally then, what role does the imagination play in transhumanism? What is it doing, and what does that doing signify? And then the subset questions. What is the human imagination doing when it invents other forms of intelligent life? And why is it doing this? How does human creativity, so profoundly associated with the imagination, relate to the co-evolving creativity that informs what we are and what we do? And how does this co-evolving creativity, in which human inventiveness plays such an important part, relate to a theologically informed understanding of creation that takes account of the economy of salvation? Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we have some time now for question and answer. It looks like someone coming up with a microphone. Perhaps I will just do that right here. Go ahead and pop up your hands.
Thank you for this very inspiring talk. Questioning is a piety of thought, so here we with the questions. Okay, so imagination, same as soul, something more than human beings, or being human beings. So I would like to know, or try to ask you a question. Do you think there is something which is unimaginable? And where do the monsters lie? In this unimaginable or in an imaginable? And also, do you see creativity which is always and was related with the imagination, as something which is a gift, which comes outside of human beings, from outside of human beings, or something which is referring to your talk about Jung and psychoanalysis, inside of human beings, and therefore maybe can be reinvented, transferred to some other human created beings, or is something which we can't actually control. Thank you.
Right. So you've got two questions. Can you remember? I'm trying to remember what the first one was quite clear. But
The first question is, what would be something which is unimaginable?
Okay, that's right. Okay. Thank you. That really helps to put it briefly. Let's deal with what the unimaginable. And I want to go back again to Augustine, because in fact what human beings are for Augustine is balanced between an interiority they will never get to the end of, and an exteriority in the mystery of God that they will never get to the end of either. So on both sides of that kind of balance, if you like, that human consciousness walks, then you have got the apophatic, the things that cannot be accessed, the things that are beyond the imagination. When you come into the imagination, then in fact we can deal with them. But when they're outside the imagination, there are some things therefore that we are not able to imagine. And the moment they emerge in the imagination is the moment then that we can say, we imagine them. Come back to that then, whence then does this come from? Of course, the romantic imagination from people like Coleridge, for example, was in fact that the imagination was some kind of repetition in the human mind of a divine gift, and that therefore engaging in that imagination was engaging in a new kind of creativity. Earlier than Coleridge, Sir Philip Sidney in the Renaissance actually saw what he was doing in his writing, for example, of his book Arcadia, was in fact trying to reimagine the Eden that was lost, because that was the way to restore Eden to us. And so imagination became then a way of actually bringing and returning back that which had been corrupted by sin. For my own self, and in the book that I've just been finished, I actually want to come to terms. I don't want to deal very much with the romantic imagination, because the imagination is also that which is most destructive. It is the imagination that enables the Twin Towers to be torpedoed by those planes. It's the imagination that causes atrocity. It's the imagination that can actually work out the direst of terrors, the most frightening kinds of tortures. Anyone reading something like 1984 and Room 101, it is the imagination which can get to your worst fears and start to enact them. So the imagination has the gift of being restorative, the gift of being creative in a good way, in a way that offers us models for possibility. I think actually something like the way the imagination works in the Bible, in offering us accounts of paradise, accounts of life in a community in which there's milk and there's honey, and you give to the alien and you look after the orphan and you take care of the widow. It is creatively giving us pictures of something which is good and that is a part of divine justice and social harmony. But also, the imagination creates its most difficult images of evil. And what I like about Augustine, to finish on Augustine, is that actually he was very well aware of that. And up until really until the 18th century, imagination was a very kind of difficult word to use, because in fact phantasmata could be devilish as much as it could be angelic. And there was always always an awareness of that. In the Magnificat, it's the imaginations of the wicked imaginations of our hearts, right? So it's both. All right, so.
Hi, Scott Hawley.
I need to needs to be raised higher. Go on.
Thank you for your talk. Many very interesting questions. The various depictions of vampires that you've delineated for us all seem to have this necessarily predatory relationship with human beings, whereby even if they're celebrities, they're still requiring the human blood force and so forth. And we see, for example, like in the Matrix trilogies, the AIs are farming humans for their life force. Yeah. But I don't see in Bostrom's work, it's not obvious to me that the superintelligences that he's talking about necessarily need to somehow feed on humans or use them for food. So in setting up the archetype of the AI vampire, how is the vampiric or predatory relationship fleshed out a little more?
Okay, let me go back to the Bostrom book, because there is not, he imagines, it's a very interesting book for what it is as a genre, because it is indulging in these kind of thought games, which are really quite sci-fi-ish. But in his imagination and in his construction of what he calls the wise singleton, in other words, if there is superintelligence, would there be a competition between superintelligence such that eventually you would have the superintelligence, and so you would have to have the wise singleton? And then from that, he actually does a kind of expanding profile of what this wise singleton would therefore need to be able to control in order to actually always be the self-sufficient singleton. And that moves out from the earth, moves out from the solar system, moves out into the universe as we know it, and it has to use everything within it. So it's that kind of sense in which, yes, actually there was something very predatory about this. And it's that image that kind of, it's when you move from, the kind of iRobots, if you like, to the super singletons that will consume everything. And it's still that predatory consumption thing, and what they're feeding on. So I'm glad you mentioned the Matrix. The Matrix is fascinating for the way in which the computer system is actually already convincing us. There are times when you're reading Bostrom's book when you kind of think, has this already happened? Are we already living in this kind of singleton's universe, but we don't quite know it yet? And he plays with that edginess. It's quite clever.
Thank you, Professor, for a really fascinating presentation. What is the human imagination? Some of the things that hit me from here, listening to you, as you talk about Jung and the fact that the darkness he went through was particularly a reaction to the First World War.
No, it was before. It happened before the First World War.
Well, it happened before.
Yeah, it was just before he signed up when it all began. The journal goes through the First World War, but the hallucinations and the psychosis were beginning before. But go on
Yes.
with your question.
It is. I mean, I was just thinking this whole business about that it was war and had and something absolutely terrible which was happening historically within his own time. And also one could say, surely, when one talks about the eschaton as it's seen in the scriptures, that they again were talking about a possible ending of the world, and because they were seeing the cruelty of the Roman Empire as being not such a good thing. But surely what is the human imagination doing today is that we are also facing, actually, I mean, it's not just the Christian tradition. I mean, the Muslim tradition has also taken up in a very black way with the Twin Towers, the whole idea of the eschaton. but we're actually, you know, we are facing, with this heat wave and whatnot, we are facing the realities of unprecedented climate change. And also the whole of, you know, if you look at science fiction films, which I find it fascinating that you've been reflecting on, over and over again, they are always, almost all of them are talking about a very black future. And surely theology and the possibility of what we're talking about, you know, transhumanism and whatnot, is what can human beings do to stop us continually rushing towards this horrible black future?
Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. And in fact, what is interesting in the depictions of these imaginary creatures, whether they're avatars or whether they're androids or whether they're vampires, is the way they reflect back upon the cultures that we actually inhabit. I think Blade Runner 2049 is a post-apocalyptic culture that's actually being imagined. And I'm not sure that, though, that one of the most interesting responses to Nick Bostrom's work on superintelligence is how frightening the whole process is. And the idea that there might be a future that, in fact, transcends human destructiveness is not completely, yes, that's actually recognized as human destructiveness is recognized there, but there's something that will be uncontrolled because it's going to be something that we cannot actually imagine at the moment. If we could imagine what a superintelligence is, then it's not superintelligent. I mean, that's part of the paradox that Nick Bostrom's actually dealing with. Therefore, there are levels of kind of the apophatic, the unimaginable that are there, but there are very sinister. I mean, talking to various people who've read the book and actually found it very frightening, very kind of dystopian in the world it was actually presenting, even though actually there are some, you know, very strong kind of models for improving human condition. But and that's what fascinates me most. I mean, my question, if you like, is in coevolution, where culture is having a role in the kinds of creatures we not only imagine, but that these imagined creatures have some kind of effect upon the nature of nature as we know it, as it's moving forward. What role does the imagination play in our imagining the kinds of superintelligences that Nick Bostrom is doing? What is that actually doing to actually further our co-evolution itself? It can't be a separate process. It's part of the way we've actually always envisaged. You know, Leonardo could envisage men flying. Eventually, that becomes something that we can actually do. So it's the imagining that then, in fact, is reflective of certain things in that culture, but also changes certain things within that culture that bring about certain kind of effects later on. So what we imagine, I always find this absolutely fascinating because you get told off time and time again using Harry Potter illustrations. It's just entertainment. There is nothing that's just entertainment. These things have effect. We take them in. They actually have an effect upon us, and they have an effect, therefore, upon the ways in which we think, we behave, and envisage futures or dystopias.
Thank you very much. And I think the line of thought you were just tracing actually helps answer my question, which is really about being a theologian at this intersection of theology and culture. And so more of a practitioner's question, I guess. Could you comment a little bit more expansively on how you approach the language of soul? And I mean, what the language of soul is actually doing in this conversation? Because you often hear it as a showstopper by some theologians who would be skittish by a co-evolutionary kind of approach. So that the appeal to the soul becomes this kind of fideistic, well, this is what makes us unique as humans. But it's definitely not what you're doing.
No.
And I'm really appreciative for what you're doing. So I'd like you to expand on, is it this kind of stretching forth of the imagination that theologians wanting to converse with transhumanists like Bostrom ought to be appealing to? And I was thinking of like that verse that you didn't mention, 1 John, about how what we will be has not yet been revealed. But we will, things like that. Is that kind of where you see
That's where I see
more tooth in the conversation?
And I would go back to a much more Hebrew model of soul as nefesh, as life, as breath. And I'm very interested in the way in which, in science, there's a whole origins of life science. If you see last week's cover of New Scientist, they're going through all the models that there are at the moment of the origins of life and how life could have originated. But I think there's something that, in fact, the religious cultures have always kept very, that life itself is the gift. And it's what you do with that life that is the important thing. And it's that doing of that thing with the life that has been given to you that I would call soul formation. And it strikes me, I'm going to do it. Films just come to mind entirely. So the last clip, the last scene from Saving Private Ryan. Remember, he's seeing everybody else was killed in the battalion, and he then stands before the graves in Ypres, wherever it was, and he simply says, "Tell me that I'm a good man. Tell me that I have lived a good life." And there's nothing so explicitly religious in the rest of the film, but that's the kind that is, if you like, that's about the soul formation. That is what you offer. Tell me at the end that I've actually contributed, rather than actually just been a parasite. Yeah. So that's what I mean by that soul formation. And I think actually what is really important about what we do as theologians, we keep a vision alive, an imaginative vision alive. Not alone, but we keep it alive. I come back to that time, and in some ways, to answer the question before, I come back to those lines in Paul that we hope beyond hope. We are engaged in practices of hope. So we are engaged in future-orientated practices of hope. And in that, we tell the stories and we live the experience and whatever. And I think that is an imaginative gift, that not just Christianity, because Christianity also is involved with other religions. And I don't want to, but it's a gift that we give. The religious imagination is a gift that we give. And that comes back to that question, then is there something religious? Is there something about the imagination which actually is religious in nature? And I think yes and no. It can be both dynamic in changing the way people think about things and totally destructive. There are other questions? Okay.
Actually, there are some limits of human imagination, and there should be a kind of a distinction between human imagination and transhuman imagination. In fact, transhuman imagination goes beyond the very idea of self or identity and leads us to a certain kind of an aporia where we seek an ultimate spirit to guide us and at the same time try and enhance our capabilities beyond the possible limits that we can think of. So therefore, the transhuman possibilities of imagination is an act of boundary crossing, which all have come out very well. But my question is, given that we succeed in that mode of imagination, how do we reconfigure our human self we need to correspondingly change our terms of discourse, and that is not coming forth so well. We just keep veering around the idea of imagination without really setting forth terms of discourse in terms of which we can re-identify, recategorize, and recontextualize something like a post-self human being or transhuman being.
Thank you. That's a really good question, and it's one that I think theologians are actually working in and with, because it just seems to me that, and Bostrom is interesting here. I was really interested in the way the dualism, that's a Cartesian dualism, still is there in some kind of way. The residual individuation that is the very modern social atomism is still there in the same way. And in fact, what I think the imagination in its trying to imagine the transhuman is trying to do, or the post-human, is actually to come up, is trying to refigure notions of the self which don't, they, in other words, that atomized, selfish, predatory notion of the self that pulls everything into itself, the ego which dominates and controls, that it seems to me has been, it doesn't match up to experience. People's experiences are of dependence. They're not of independence. There are actually experiences of needing others, of being in communication, of being in relation. And I think actually that part of what, and that's part of what the religious imagination has always said, that we are not these hyper-individuals that are just pursuing our own lines and our own lifestyles irrespective of other people. We are actually people that are built in delicate ecosystems of responsibility and response. And I think actually that one of the things that the religious imagination and one of the things that we're doing with is actually to make people imagine a world that actually is closer to what they recognize to be true, to their experience. That they don't recognize, they don't recognize the kind of celebrity status of I'm independent and can do anything I want. I'm, the beautiful, the well-fed, the well-groomed, the rich. They don't reckon that's not what most of us are like. So there's a kind of, so it seems to me that what we're doing and what religions do is configure ways of actually understanding ourselves and human being in a dynamic way that's going forward, but in a way that actually, if you like, the model in Christianity is dispossession. But the dispossession in Christ is not that you lose yourself, but you find yourself. So you find what you are by actually being dispossessed. And I think that that's part of the imaginative gift that something like Christianity can give to the world. That in fact, we don't live like these modern egos. We actually live collectively, much more collectively than we actually think. So there's one more. No, there's two more. But perhaps if I took these two, do you want me to take these two? Okay. Dispossessing themselves. Brilliant.
So do you think that I think there's something about Bostrom that is grotesque and monstrous. And I wonder if it's a hope of trying to enact this post-Enlightenment notion of an isolated individual that is super intelligent, and so the very thing that he's hoping or he's imagining is some Pollyannish view of what that romantic view in a way of what that should be, but he misses the monstrous dimension of it, and that's the part that's unimaginable. The very thing that he's imagining is the thing that is unimaginable because of its darkness. So I'm trying to get back to this the question of the monstrous in the midst of all of the imagination here. So I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about the monstrous dimension of a lot of the transhumanist literature.
I think Bostrom is a fascinating read. As someone who would be sitting down and think, okay, let's think this through. He's got a wonderful mathematical mind. Let's think this through. This is what we've got. Where is this going to lead? All right. So you go from almost the scientifically factual into the science fiction before, and you're just carried there with a lot of kind of data behind it and mathematical equations and wonderful kind of algorithmic soups all along the way, and you are, but if you go and take look this, if you stop seeing this as hard science and actually see it as a product of the imagination, what you're seeing is something that politically is totally fascist and frighteningly fascist, actually, and that seems to me to be something that is where Bostrom's imagination is linking up with a much more global fear at the moment, that this is where we're heading. We're heading towards some superpower which is actually going to control. And when you see some of the, you go through some of the sci-fi films, I'm just thinking of the ones that picture Roderick, Chronicles of Roderick would be one, where in fact this is what it is. It's a form of fascism. Or the Matrix, that too is a form of fascism. And it kind of is interesting to me what that is. So rather than thinking, okay, this is the blueprint for the future, which is what the book pretends as if it's actually going to be, and see, no, this is a product of the human imagination today, and what it is most fearful and fascinated by, then we come up with the different kinds of appreciation of what's going on in the book.
There's a kind of power that's there in actually potentially bringing it into existence.
Yes.
And the last time we did that in the last century, it didn't work out so well. And yet there's still this drive to the efficiency and effectiveness of the productivity is what is the most frightening.
Well, and the psychologists like Jung would say, this is what the unconscious does, is to project its deepest fears. And the deepest fears in being projected will eventually become conscious. And then they'll become institutional. So it's like the old kind of gospel mantra: beware what you pray for. It's the same thing. Beware what you imagine.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, Graham, for sparing the time, even amid all the exams that are going on here at Oxford at the moment. We've had three amazing talks so far in the conference, and it's a great treat. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our speaker.